Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore and studies and analyzes issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, in this episode, I want to discuss Iran and Israel. The decades-long Iran-Israel covert war is now over. It began with Iran's direct aerial strikes against military targets in Israel after Israel's illegal strike on Iran's consulate building in Damascus, which killed a number of senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers. Israel retaliated with a limited strike. This was back in April, targeting an airbase and some air defense batteries. Iran again struck Israel on October 1st, this time using near versions, most likely Fatah 1 and Khyber Shikan missiles. Many of those missiles did escape the Israeli three-tiered ground anti-access area denial shield. Israel retaliated on the morning of last Saturday in three waves that struck targets at three locations. While Iran has downplayed the attacks, most experts believe Israeli warplanes struck multiple targets, including Iran's downed A280 batteries, and most importantly, planetary mixers used to produce solid fuel for Iran's missiles. While Iran has said that it reserves the right to counter-retaliate, it seems that for now, it does not plan to go up the escalation ladder, at least not in an immediate retaliatory mode. One big question today is the why and how of this transition from covert to overt hostilities. And this question is important because Iran has traditionally used the strategy of the indirect approach and honed its asymmetric capabilities. Was changing that approach a mistake? Did the Hamas attack and Israel's subsequent military actions force Iran's hand? Has Israel been able to establish deterrence? If not, what purpose have these strikes served, especially if Iran returns to its indirect approach, which it likely will? Now that hostilities have become overt and the taboo of direct strikes has been broken, are the two sides poised to get into a new normal, which requires escalation management? To discuss these questions, I have with me Dr. Avner Cohen. Cohen is a professor at the Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and the author of Israel and the Bomb and the Worst Kept Secret, Israel's Bargain with the Bomb. With him is Dr. Mehrdad Khonsari, a former Iranian diplomat, politician, and director of Iranian Center for Policy Studies, or Markaz Irani Mutaliat Siyasi. In fact, I was very interested to see that policy was translated as Siyasi, because normally Siyasat is politics. So we'll talk about that later. And Dr. Arman Mahmoudian, who's a research fellow at the Global and National Security Institute, University of South Florida. Mahmoudian's research focuses on the Middle East with reference to Iran's regional policy and also Russia's foreign policy with reference to Eastern Europe. So welcome to my panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Cohen here. Dr. Cohen, is this a new normal? The overt, attacks, direct attacks against each other? Or do you think at some point the two sides are going to go back to the covert activities, which obviously they've been involved in for many decades now?
There is no doubt that certain taboo has been broken. I hope it's not going to be a new norm. I think both countries, Iran and Israel, cannot bring themselves into a situation of a ping pong, some kind of attrition war, in terms of the damage to their economy, in terms of the damage to their reputation in the region. I think their population cannot handle that kind of thing, and I don't think they want to go to that kind of situation. I think it was an effort to reformulate, to redesign the rule of the game between the two countries. A great deal depends what Iran would do now. I hope that Iran, even though on the declaratory level it claims to keep the right to retaliate, I hope it would not do so. And I hope that it would lead into some kind of ceasefire and end of immediate hostilities in Lebanon, which Iran could be an instrument in doing so. So I think the question that you raise is intriguing indeed, and we are not in a position to give an answer to that. Very much depends in the unfolding events.
As I said in my opening, my own sense is that Iran is not going to retaliate immediately. I also think that Iran will probably not retaliate directly and overtly, but it will go back to its asymmetric, indirect approach to conflict. Because as far as the conflict is concerned, and I understand what you're saying, but the conflict has its own structures. And for Iran to pull back from this conflict, or the axis of resistance, if you will, certain things need to change within Israel Palestine. And from what I can see of Benjamin Netanyahu's policies, I don't think that's likely to change. I don't know if you would agree with me on that.
I agree with you.
So, okay, I'm going to come back to this because I think this is a very important question. But let me go to Dr. Khonsari here. Khonsari, how do you look at? I mean, one of the most important, one of the priorities for Iran is the survival of the regime. And then, of course, to get the United States out of the Middle East, and, of course, an equitable settlement of the Palestine issue. So, do you think that Iran is going to pull back from counter retaliation at this point after having taken a hit, and then kind of hunker down a little and go for the strategy of the indirect approach?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My feeling is that Iran is going to be very strong in talk and propaganda, but very careful in terms of taking further action. It is clear that at no time since October 7th has Iran really wanted things to escalate beyond certain perimeters, and they have never wanted all-out war with Israel, and I don't think they wanted Hezbollah to even get engaged in the level that things have unfolded in the last several months. So I think that they will talk of retaliation, they will talk big, but they are not in a position really of wanting to escalate matters, because they don't have the resources and domestic. If, for example, the situation was to have it, if subsequent Israeli attacks were to have to damage facilities that involve the ordinary citizen, then they would have far more trouble than they need. So they are anxious to avoid things like that. But I don't see them being able to revert at the same time to the kind of asymmetric warfare that they were conducting prior to October 7th, in the sense that, first of all, the United States and even the United Kingdom is involved in direct conflict with some of the members of the axis of evil, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen or certain militias in Iraq and Syria. So it was only Hezbollah that the Americans and the UK were not confronting directly, which Israel has. And with Hezbollah having been degraded to the level that it has, I just don't think Iran is capable of playing the kind of game that it was able to play. And I think that in the coming months, we will see a gradual, collapse of that strategy of Iran, and more focus and more attention will be focused on the Iranian regime inside Iran. And that is a thing, obviously, that they're fearful. And many of the calculation with regards to responding or not responding hinges back or goes back to that.
Right. Interesting. So, Arman, a couple of things. One, of course, I won't carry forward what Dr. Khonsari has said with reference to how this is going to play out. my own sense is that he's right that Iran has never wanted to get into a direct confrontation with Israel, or for that matter, the United States. Iran has been focused on, despite sanctions, on sort of modernizing its military, increasing its missile capabilities, getting to being a threshold nuclear weapon state, and also, of course, getting closer to Russia and China and getting its economy back on track, et cetera, et cetera. But as happens in conflicts, we've seen throughout history, you kind of walk into one because you're not the only actor. You're acting, but you're also reacting to external stimuli. And then so the Hamas attack and then Hezbollah's decision to begin to sort of in a calibrated way support Hamas. And then, of course, the Israeli actions of actually taking out Hezbollah commanders. I'm talking about the initial wave. And also certain Hamas commanders in Lebanon. And then, of course, taking out Ismail Haniya in Tehran. So all of this kind of then gets into a different kind of calculus where even if you don't want to get into a direct conflict, you kind of pushed into it because of a certain kind of commitment trap. So that's one, and I want to get your view on that. And second point that Dr. Khonsari has raised about the internal situation, I would like to get your view on that also, with respect to regime survival and legitimacy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your question. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm here to learn from you, Dr. Khonsari, and Dr. Cohen. So I'll only share my 2 cents. I'm on board with both of the speakers and also the Dr. Khonsari's note on the collapse, or moving toward the collapse of the Iran's deterrence strategy. Look, Iranian revolutionary government since the very beginning. I mean, they are ideologue, they say ideologic thing, but they have a practical and realistic understanding of their power and the power of their adversaries. They're being aware of the fact that when it comes to the conventional or unconventional method of warfare, they are behind the Israelis. More important, they are behind the United States. They can't match them. So this whole establishment of the axis of resistance was Iran's remedy, to this situation. Iranian basically were not counting that those members of the axis of resistance would win a war, but being counting on that they will inflict a pain or cost on the Israelis or the Americans that push them back. So what is Iran doing actually since the April to the today is kind of against the very same policy. I mean, once they launched let's say that the second honest promise or the second retaliation against Israel, they made the reasoning of it. It was that the killing of the new Shafarin, Iranian IRGC commander in Beirut, and also the assassination of Nasrallah, they were together. It really didn't make sense to me. I mean, because what I understood, I might be wrong from the Iranians' point of view, that the proxy has been created, funded, established, sponsored to fight Iran's wars or battles. Now it seems Iran is going in a very opposite direction. I mean, Iran is getting engaged in order to take retaliation for them, to revenge or avenge their death, or even to save them, which defeats the entire purpose. I'm not sure. I don't know to what extent Iranians are planning to continue this reverse, or let's say that defeating the initial purpose. But I think right now it is really not in favor of the Iranian to continue this round of ping pong exchange of fire with the Israelis. Iran is at a very, very vulnerable spot.
Right.
Yeah.
I just want to a two-finger intervention, if I may. I understand perfectly what you're saying, but it's like the kind of commitment as the leader of the axis of resistance, or as a mentor of the axis of resistance. You have a certain level of commitment. And while I completely agree with you that the current Iranian actions have been the polar opposite of the traditional Iranian policy, it's almost like what the chess players call zugzwang, a situation in which a player has to make a move, but the very act of making the move is to the player's disadvantage. So it seems to me that that's the kind of situation that Iran found itself in.
It is true. It's a, let's say, that ideological and moral dilemma, if you may so say so, for Iranian to also may fulfill that commitment. What the question is that what is the highest commitment? Because at the end, all of these proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis, to some extent Hamas, their survival to a great extent relies on the survival of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Look, it's not me saying it, is Hassan Nasrallah saying that Iran has provided Hezbollah with its missile to its yogurt, quote unquote. So basically, whatever they had came from the Iranian. According to the U.S. Treasury Department, Hezbollah received post 2017-18 $800 million from Iranians. So the question is that to what extent Iran can fulfill that ideological symbolic commitment without endangering itself with the which would lead to endangering actually the highest commitment Iranian have to these proxies, sponsoring them and sustaining their survival. But because if Iran collapsed, if Iran is jeopardized, is the survival of the regime is endangered, if the regime cannot no longer physically carry out itself, they simply cannot also sponsor these groups, they simply cannot arm them, and that, I think, that would be actually project a greater level of threat against their existence.
Which brings us to the second question with reference to the internal situation, whether it's the Baloch insurgents, whether it's the Kurds, or whether it's the Khuzestani Awazi Arabs. I mean, so there are these issues internally, and of course a large segment of the population, which obviously we saw after Masa Amini's death in custody, the protests and all that. And there is evidence that Israel knows about these fault lines, and I am sure, as I'm talking to you right now, Israel will be, it makes eminent sense to me, will be covertly trying to, increase those fault lines. So, what is your assessment of the internal situation?
Well, it is no secret that domestically wise, Islamic Republic, it is in its most vulnerable position. Look, statically speaking, if you want to go only with numbers, which is not up to my understanding or anybody else's understanding, the number of protests, the frequency of the protests has increased. The space, time-wise space between protests in Iran also has increased. In nature, also protests has been diversified. They are no longer only student related or political related. We have protests regarding the economy. We have protests regarding actually climate change, like the water shortage and drought. We have protests over, let's say, the gender policies, the women movement. We have protests over ethnic rights. So it is no secret in terms of domestic pressure that the Islamic Republic feels. The pressure is at highest all time ever been recorded. And that's not me saying, it's also some of the officials of the Islamic Republic has indirectly confirmed the gap between them and specifically speaking youth, which is still are the majority of the country, although Iran is now aging country, is quite deep. And we can
that was one of the reasons to actually get Pezeshkian in as one of the presidential candidates, and then Pezeshkian also winning the race. Is that part of the policy to try and somehow address some of these concerns by having someone who's considered moderate?
Might be, but if it was the case, so they should have authorized him to also actually do some reforms. It doesn't seem that he has been authorized. I think Mr. Pezeshkian was allowed to be a president mostly maybe because on a symbolic level they fill the gap, but also Islamic Republic has shown a tendency that whenever they want to make a deal with the West, they would have a reformist president or reformist person in charge to make that deal for two reasons. First of all, they are more acceptable and welcomed by the Western countries. And second of all, if the deal goes wrong, they are the best to blame rather than the conservatives. I don't know which direction Ayatollah Khamenei went, but if the goal was to establish a detente with the public, there should have been a genuine reform. We haven't seen reform.
One could possibly say that President Pezeshkian hasn't really had the time, given this whole conflict scenario, for him to sort of get down to doing those reforms domestically. But I'm going to circle back with this question to Dr. Khonsari and get his assessment. But I want to go back to Dr. Cohen. And Dr. Cohen, so uh, let's assume that Iran doesn't immediately retaliate. I don't want to press the point, but I think that they're going to go indirectly because of the structural reasons. But here's the thing. I want to get your assessment of what's happening in Israel. Now, Yoav Gallant has written, he's the defense minister, he's the former general of the IDF, he's written a letter saying, I have no idea where this thing is going. Uh, I don't think there's a policy, and we are just getting into conflicts and so on and so forth. To which Netanyahu's office has responded by saying this is wrong. There is a clear policy. There is an update every day. Now, the question is that unless Israel seriously gets down to the job of accepting that without giving Palestinians their dignity and their right to self-determination, this will be an existential war which will be never ending. It will become self-contained. Do you think, and I ask you this question because from where I stand, I do not think that that's happening, but I want to get your view on whether you think there is any space left in Israel about this kind of approach, or are we talking about a never-ending war?
You ask questions that many Israeli ask themselves. Some with despair, with even horror. Some with a slight, cautious, optimistic look. On the surface, Netanyahu was, in a very surprising way, being a leader that under his watch, Israel had his worst blow ever, and the worst blow that the Jewish people had since the Holocaust. He was able to recover politically to the extent that nobody thought that he could. Right now, he has quite solid parliamentary, on the surface, majority of 69 or so out of the 120 members. So on the surface, he's not likely to lose his power, and possibly he could maintain until the regular date of election, which is November 9th, 2026. At the same time, various polls that were shown that were taking place in Israel in the last week or so shows that 60 to 70% of the Israeli population believe that he conducts the war in a terrible way. They're not satisfied with the way that you run the war. 80% or so, nearly 80%, demanding to have independent commission of inquiry to look what led to these colossal things. And in a surprising way, the most favored minister within this cabinet is the one who is about to be fired, Mr. Yoav Gallant. You mentioned the letter, and you mentioned the Netanyahu response. There are looming some two major issues that, in a surprising way, both of them could unravel the government, despite what looks that this government has the solid majority. One is the issue of the drafting of the ultra orthodox. It's a very painful issue. Netanyahu has promised that, has pledged to the ultra orthodox factions, and there is opposition, even included Likud, even the small party that joined him, headed by Mr. Saar, and Gallant is presenting his own view, which is against much of compromise on this issue, and this issue is looming, so it could lead quite quickly to a crisis. The other issue of the national budget, which here also there are some major, given the war, given the fact that Israel economic situation is much worse than it has been before the war. There are all sorts of issues. And the two issues, the issue of the drafting of the ultra Orthodox and the budget, are connected. So, in the view of many, the apparent stability of this government is not a solid reality, and things could happen. And there is a yearning in the Israeli public to have a new elections, to have this independent commission of investigations. And as I said, 70% of the people do not like Netanyahu and would like him to be gone. 60, 70%. That's quite significant. So underlying, there is a lot of seeds for fractions and ultimately for the collapse of the government. I agree with you that as long as Netanyahu is in power and as long as he is able to maintain this government, I do not see any major change vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And his own interest, in part because of personal interest, because of his criminal case, which he's supposed to testify on December 2nd, to start a long testimony in court. All those are really issues that are put a strain on the solidity of this government.
So there is a supplementary question which kind of links up with this. Let's assume that Netanyahu somehow is ousted as prime minister. Do you think that opens up space for, because everything that we've talked about up until now, in terms of protests in Israel, they're about the conduct of the war, they're about why the captured Israelis have not been brought back, and the economy is not doing too well, and so on and so forth. But there is no debate about how and why this particular iteration of the war began and why it is important to reach out to the Palestinians. Those questions are not being asked currently, but my question is that if Netanyahu goes, if these characters like Ben Gvir and Smotrich somehow are no more in power, do you think there's going to be space for this conversation to happen? That the only way for Israelis to actually be safe and secure is not necessarily through the Arrow 2 and 3 and Iron Dome and the rest of it, but to actually begin to have some kind of decent relationship with the Palestinians?
Voices towards that direction are being raised by quite a few individuals. But it is within the Israeli elite. It's within the center and the left, and the center and the left, because of October 7, have suffered a blow. One must acknowledge the fact that by and large, Israeli domestic politics has moved to the right after October 7th. So it will be tricky to make a transformational change. I think that even though many individuals and possibly even some leaders within the right have realized that we need to build a new relationship, and I agree with you, this cannot be done unless Netanyahu is gone. And my own view is that once Netanyahu is gone, the Israeli domestic political scene, the whole Israeli political landscape, is likely to change. I think a lot of new faces and new voices will enter into the picture. I think that many, most likely the majority of the current leaders will be gone, will be out of the scene. So I think the country is ready to some kind of reshuffle and to have new voices. But at the same time, one must acknowledge that under the current situations, and as the war is still being waged, and it's a war that waged in two very intense frontiers, Gaza and the Hezbollah in the north, but also is the Palestinian in the West Bank, also the Houthis, and also even Iraq and Syria. So it's a situation that Israel has not found itself. It's not secret that the Israeli army is exhausted, totally exhausted. People mobilized for reserves for the fourth and fifth times. It never happened before. 140 days a year for people in their 30s that are part of the Israeli economy. Israel cannot sustain that kind of situation. So there is a need, there is a real need to change that. and it needs to be done by politics. So I'm cautiously optimistic. But I agree with you that for the short run, as long as Netanyahu is in power with this coalition, I do not see any chance for any major change, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And on this issue of sustainment, frankly, Dr. Cohen, I just wrote a piece which will appear next Sunday in one of our papers, which is the fact that this war has basically been sustained by the United States, because without the US support in terms of financial support and the military support, Israel simply could not have sustained this war. And of course, the human element that you talked about in terms of reservists being called up with 3 or 4 times, which reminds me of a recent letter by some of the reservists who said that they cannot report for duty, and they've given their reasons. The rest of it.
And now you bring the other factor, which is as of now quite uncertain, it's the U.S. election. I think a
Yeah,
great deal, there is no question Netanyahu has been suspended and suspended decisions to see what would happen in the U.S. He put
absolutely.
his fate very much with Trump.
Yeah,
Um, Currently, some people think that he may be right. Uh, it's totally unknown. In my
yeah,
view, it's difficult to say how this election here in the United States going to be fated. And I don't think that even the Israeli right reliance on Trump is a very stable one.
yeah.
Trump is transactional, he is erratic, and under some circumstances, he is very much non-interventionalist, and he could say tough things to Israel, even of Netanyahu. Biden and Kamala Harris were much more stable and much more reliable in some sense, even they had criticism about the conduct of the war. With Trump, is much less predictable. So that's a huge factor of uncertainty that sheds on the entire situation.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. Dr. Khonsari, you've been hearing this patiently. You heard Arman's assessment also of the internal Iranian situation. You heard Dr. Cohen talk about the Israeli internal situation. How do you, I mean, in terms of, and I know I should never do this, because when someone does this to me, I never like it. Trying to extrapolate into the future on the basis of current trend lines is always very tricky. But nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to try and sort of give me a sense of what's going to happen. What do you think is likely to happen in the next, let's say, 3 to 6 months?
Well, one thing that I would like to just perhaps Dr. Cohen could elaborate. The polls in Israel also indicate that the majority of Israelis are not in favor of a Palestinian state. So if they are
As
not
of
in
now.
favor of a Palestinian state, the removal of Netanyahu from the scene is not going to make that kind of a difference that your initial question
As of now.
as a alluded to, in the sense that anybody else who comes, they're all politicians and they look to the polls and they want to survive, so they're unlikely to initiate steps that are not considered popular at this stage. I don't see the fact that this could be a long-term thing, but certainly I don't hinge the change of attitude or policy in Israel to simply the disappearance of Netanyahu, because anybody else who comes, who's likely to come, because you're not going to get people coming from the left or center, assuming power in Israel. It's going to be somebody else from the right, and I don't see them changing. So that is a given. But in terms of what is likely to happen, first of all, I think that we are at a critical juncture in the Middle East, in the sense that with what has happened, especially in the aftermath of the degradation of Hezbollah, is that the trajectory of radical fundamentalist Islam in the region, which began with Ayatollah Khomeini, which had been on an upward swing, is now being halted. And I think that with the collapse of Iran, with the degradation of Iran. I mean, you can't say collapse. Collapse is, you have to define that. But Iran will not be able to play the same kind of proxy policy in the coming months as it did in the previous years, 10 years, let's say.
That's very interesting, because my own sense is completely the opposite. But
Well,
go on.
my sense that they won't, and I think that the fact is that, for example, Netanyahu insistence on, for example, some kind of a ceasefire in Gaza, which does not leave Hamas in charge. I mean, that is a critical point. If there is a ceasefire with Hamas still in charge of running Gaza, that is a tremendous propaganda victory for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it could perpetuate radical Islam, Sunni, Shia, both types, for the next generation. If, on the other hand, as we are seeing the signs that the Israeli government is uncompromising on that issue, and if that issue is fought to the end, which I don't think there's a long time to go, then that would see a downward swing in the rise of radical and popular Islam, and radical and fundamentalist Islam, and it will see a reappearance of moderate Arab countries. And I have to say this about the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf and the more traditional, more Arabs. They pay lip service to the cause of the Palestinians and all of that because of their own internal population. But they have no love for the Hamas type of Islam or the Hezbollah type of Islam, and they are kind of happy, I think, in their heart of hearts that these people have been sidelined. So you will see, in my view, a reemergence of Saudi Arabia, UAE, countries like that with money, especially under the guise of reconstruction and so on and so forth, making a re-entry both in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, places like that, as Iranian, you might say, leverage becomes less. And I think, as I said earlier, that I see that in the next several months, that pressure against Iran, which had deliberately, as Dr. Mahmoudian said, had been focused on combating Iran outside Iranian territory. In other words, in the region. Focus of the United States, Israel, everybody else was to combat these proxies in where they were, where they posed a threat. As that threat becomes more diminished, less, you might say, harmful, that attention is going to shift against the Islamic Republic to inside Iran. Obviously, right now, the biggest comfort that the Islamic regime has is that there is no credible opposition to it that can challenge it or that can replace it. And I have to say that, based on what you yourself alluded to, although these separatist movements are insignificant, they are mercenaries. They are used as tools to pressurize the Islamic Republic, but they're not in a position of doing anything significant or beyond certain levels. But the point is that the Islamic regime, as bad as it is, from perspective of somebody like me, is not the worst alternative for Iran. So that is something that I think people who think responsibly are very cautious as to how we move in the future, because we do not want, certainly, to have the kind of scenarios that you earlier alluded to from becoming a reality. They are insignificant, but there's no reason why, Iran could not erupt into a situation like Iraq or Syria if you're not careful. And people in Iran, of course, the general population is quite savvy about this. And as bad as the economic situation and everything else is, at least they sleep safely in their homes at night. And they don't want to jeopardize that. And I don't think that people who are on the outside should advocate unwise policies that do that. But the point is that the Islamic regime itself, Pezeshkian or anybody else, is incapable of remedying any of the basic problems. In other words, like trying to lift the sanctions. It's impossible for this regime with this ideology, with this kind of attitude to move forward on that scale. So some sort of transition is absolutely necessary, and we're going to be moving towards that until it unfolds.
Thank you, Dr. Khonsari. I mean, I have to close the program also, and I want to go back for a little while back to Arman Mahmoudian. But very quickly, Iran is now also on a broader scale, part of a bloc, an emerging bloc, or I would say an emerged bloc, which is obviously in peer competition with the United States. So Iran has the back. So that's one point. The other point, and of course, for that we have to do a completely separate program, has to do with this two-state solution, because if we go back to the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's speech at the Knesset 29 days before he was assassinated. And this was when he was presenting Oslo II for ratification to the Knesset. If you read that speech, it's very clear that Israel has never accepted a two-state solution in terms of Palestinian sovereignty, because sovereignty is one of the basics of a state. It's about an administrative authority, and that's very clear from his speech. And he paid for that peace with his life. So all I'm saying is that structurally, there are issues here which, unless dealt with very clearly, are going to play in favor of continued conflict. But Arman Mahmoudian, before I close this program, do you agree with me that the Iranian regime, given the broader geopolitics and how it's unfolding, now has the backing of Russia and, to a large extent, China, and that backing is also an important factor in its continued survival?
Well, I don't want to say I'm agree or I'm disagree, but I would say that I'm quite cautious when it comes to the Iranian relations with Russians and Chinese. I do not see any indicator that there is an alliance exists, or even I don't see any indicator there's a marriage of inconvenience, to be honest. Marriage of inconvenience is a kind of a marriage that both people at least agreed that they are in marriage. The relation that Iranians have with the Russians, specifically speaking, is a one-sided crush and love, that in which Iranians have a tendency of doubling it up, calling it alliances or whatever, and Russians are not. And they've been really frank about it. I mean, if you look at the Russia's foreign policy document, the level of the importance that they give to the Iran in terms of a partnership is below to the India and kind of next to the Saudi Arabia, and generally speaking, the same side with the Israel. And they have proved themselves. Iran has been desperately calling for the AD systems during the last year, called Russians for giving the Iran air fighters, so Su-35s. There have been various reasons that they've been delivered. One report just came this week, 2 of them been delivered. We haven't seen anything in action. The Iranian asked for Russians to give Iranians a radar. No report been indicated. Iran also has asked Russians to share the information and image that Khayyam satellite, which Iran, by the way, paid for it, but Russia carried out it, with Iranian. Russians denied it, saying that they need that satellite for the Ukraine war. So when it comes to Iran, I think Russia and China's focus. China has economic incentive, that's different, but Russia is mostly focusing on denial strategy, meaning that they don't want Iran to be in the Western campaign, but that doesn't mean that they are willing to fight for Iran. And the ultimate way that Russia, in my view, goes is that if Iran gets engaged in a war with the United States, not Israel, Russia might slightly and relatively supply Iran with arms, but not for the sake of assisting the Iranian, only to sake of getting even again with the American because of the Ukraine, as it happened to the Cold War. So to conclude it, I do not see any major backing or involvement or intervention of either Chinese or Russians at this stage of the conflict. I cannot predict how the direction of the relationship goes in a close by future or near, but for now, if it happens tomorrow, I strongly doubt that.
Okay. I think we'll have to do yet another program on this, but thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, Dr. Khonsari, Dr. Mahmoudian. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't bring me any lucre, but it certainly makes me very happy. And it also helps us bring you quality discussion. So until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.